You don't have to believe this. You don't. This isn't one of those videos where a guy gets on camera at some university or outside of a clinic to demolish the arguments of university students and then says, hey, you have to believe now, I destroyed your logic. This isn't that. When it comes to what we believe, logic rarely leads. Our experience comes first, right? And then the logic comes later. So hear me when I say, you don't have to believe this, especially if it doesn't line up with your experience. Now, let's get into this. One of the most scathing critiques of Christianity is that Christians see it as a kind of a badge of honor to cling to beliefs for which they have no evidence. It's called blind faith. I believe it even though I have zero evidence for it. And that critique is kind of a tough bullet to dodge. It seems like Christians regularly encourage one another to have blind faith that God is at work amidst a tragedy, say, although the evidence seems to point to the contrary. We encourage one another to have faith that God's going to come through and answer that prayer in one way or another, even though God seems to have an unpredictable history when it comes to answering our prayers. I mean, one of the most incriminating scriptures on this front comes from Hebrews 11. It says that faith is, here's the definition, faith is the confidence in what we hope for and assurance of what we do not see, which sounds a lot like maintaining your belief despite no evidence. And look, this is really important because demanding blind faith can be really dangerous. It's blind faith that leads extremists to blow themselves up in the street, holding fast to the belief that there's going to be a reward waiting for them in heaven, a belief for which there is no evidence. Blind faith has led some branches of Christianity to ignore the advances in medical technology that can save people's lives, denying their own children the kind of treatment they desperately need, all because an old book told them that if they pray and anoint with oil, that will be enough, they'll be healed, a belief for which there is no evidence. Blind faith leaves you open to manipulation, like televangelists telling you to plant your financial seed of faith into their ministry and that God's going to bless you with riches tenfold, a belief, again, for which there is no evidence. What might surprise you, though, is that Jesus, the central figure of the Christian faith, never actually demanded that kind of blind faith from anyone. In fact, belief without evidence has never been a core tenet of the original Christian faith at all. When Jesus' first followers asked him to help increase their faith, he didn't say, oh, you just have to believe more, you have to believe better or be stronger. No, he gave them an even stranger answer. He told them a story about a servant who did what he was told. Suppose one of you has a servant plowing or looking after sheep. Will he say to the servant when he comes in from the field, come along now and sit down to eat? Won't he rather say, prepare my supper, get yourself ready and wait on me while I eat and drink, and then you can eat and drink? Will he thank the servant because he did what he was told to do? So you also, when you've done everything that you were told to do, should say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done our duty. Now, Jesus is drawing a connection here between faith and obedience resulting in evidence. If you want to increase your trust in me, says Jesus, then increase your obedience. Why? Because it's only in putting my words into practice that you're going to be able to see whether or not your faith has been misplaced. And if you keep reading in Luke chapter 17, immediately after this, Jesus performs a few miracles all in a row. He heals 10 guys of leprosy, he restores the sight of a blind man. In other words, he gives his disciples evidence to go deeper with their obedience, to grow their faith. Faith for Jesus was never about mustering blind belief. Over and over, he invited his disciples to see what he was doing and then to put his words into deeper practice. Peter didn't drop his nets and follow Jesus simply because Jesus told him to. No, Jesus issued the invitation after performing this insane fish-catching miracle. Jesus never chastised the disciples because they lacked blind faith. They got chastised because they had already seen a ton of evidence that Jesus was worth trusting, and they still hesitated to believe. I mean, it was going to take something pretty incredible to turn this fear-filled, doubt-filled group of followers into the giants of the Christian faith that they ended up becoming. Which is actually kind of worth wondering about, isn't it? I mean, what transformed this doubting group of bumbling disciples into the fearless preachers and practitioners that ended up literally changing the world? That question brings us to the weekend that we're publishing this video, Easter. The entire Christian faith hinges on what happened on Easter. I mean, without Easter, there is no Christmas, there's no New Testament, there's no churches, there's no songs, there's no Christians. Without Easter, Jesus was just another sage on a stage who eventually got crucified, cutting his whole movement short and bringing his whole revolution to a halt. I mean, the group Jesus started struggled to have faith in him even after seeing him raise Lazarus from the dead and walk on water and feed thousands of people twice, healing multitudes and so much more. Do you really think that once he was crucified, died and buried, that they somehow then found their gumption to get up and get after it? Hey, now that Jesus is gone, let's all go and do the things that he told us to do. No, of course not. Half of them deserted him. One of them denied they knew him, and another one sold him out for some silver. The question is then, well, how'd they go from that to being the bold, world-changing preachers? I mean, something happened, and it wasn't a commitment to blind belief. My point is this: Christianity, whatever it's been turned into today, it was never supposed to be about blind faith. It's never been about believing something without any evidence. None of Jesus' first followers, the ones who were responsible for writing the documents that eventually make up what we call the New Testament, none of them ever claimed that you just have to believe without offering some form of evidence for those beliefs. I mean, Mary Magdalene, the first to see Jesus risen from the dead, didn't believe she was talking to Jesus until halfway through a conversation with him. The disciples didn't believe that Jesus had risen from the dead, even though their close friend told them that he did. It wasn't until they had breakfast with him on the beach or met with him in hiding. And the authors of the New Testament, they don't hide any of that doubt. They tell it as it was, which I appreciate because it's where a lot of us are at, right? I mean, listen to how one of the disciples, John, relays the event that took place after Jesus had apparently risen from the dead. Now Thomas, also known as Didymus or the twin, one of the 12, was not with the disciples when Jesus came. So the other disciples told him, "We've seen the Lord." But he said to them, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe." Which makes perfect sense, right? Unless I see it, I won't believe it. I mean, nobody's going to fault him for that. Nobody else believed it until they saw it either. A week later, his disciples were in the house again, and Thomas was with them this time. And though the doors were locked, Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be with you." And then he said to Thomas, "Put your finger here. See my hands. Reach out your hand and put it into my side. Stop doubting and believe." Notice he never asked his disciples to believe just because. Jesus asked them to have faith because of what they saw. Seeing is believing. I mean, that's why Thomas was able to make the switch. It was because of what he saw. Thomas said to him, "My Lord and my God." And Jesus told him, "Because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed." And John kind of interjects with his own thoughts after this and basically restates what Jesus said with some interpretation. Jesus performed many other signs in the presence of his disciples which aren't recorded in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Messiah, the Son of God, and that by believing you may have life in his name. In other words, John says, look, I get that future generations are not going to have the opportunity to see what we saw. They won't have the chance to touch the nail-scarred hands. You won't. I won't. Which is why I say you don't have to believe this. You don't have to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. We didn't experience it. So I'm not saying you have to force some blind faith. Friends, seeing is believing. The disciples weren't different than us. They weren't predisposed to believe in miracles and easily duped into believing in a resurrection that was fake. No, nobody expected anybody to walk out of that tomb. The disciples believed that Jesus rose from the dead because of what they saw. And what they saw and experienced changed them and it moved them to begin putting Jesus' words into deeper practices that did eventually change the world. And some, including this disciple named John, decided to record these early moments so that even though we didn't see it, We could still have the opportunity to believe it. But, John ends with this really important line. He says he wrote it down so that you might not believe blindly, but that your belief would be confirmed by experiencing life in his name. He's not inviting you to a belief without evidence. He's inviting you to something that Jesus called life and life to the full, the good life, a meaningful life, an eternal kind of life. He's inviting you to an experience. I mean, people were drawn to that life that Jesus talked about. They experienced it. It's why the earliest version of the Christian faith didn't just survive the first few centuries of the Common Era, but it spread like wildfire despite being crushed with pain and suffering. John's testimony is not his evidence for you, although it could be. The existence of Jesus followers today is not the evidence for you. It could be, although if you've not experienced modern Christianity to be a source of life and life to the full, then I'd suspect you'd not find it a very convincing piece of evidence for faith in Jesus, and that's okay. You don't have to believe it based on John's testimony. That's not the evidence he's inviting you to anyway, and we get this wrong all the time. Oh, you should believe it because the Bible says it. No. John didn't believe that Jesus was the promised Jewish Messiah and the Son of God because his Jewish scripture said so. He believed it because of what he experienced and saw in Jesus. You don't have to blindly believe that Jesus is who he said he is simply because a book said so, and especially not because a guy on a video said so. I'm not asking you. John's not asking you. Jesus isn't asking you for a blind faith, for belief without evidence. He never did. He said, if you want to grow your faith, your belief, your trust in me, then grow your obedience. Meaning, put his words into practice so that you can find out for yourself if he really does know the path to the good life. 2,000 years ago, a small group of 50 or so followers believed that Jesus did, not because of a book, but because of what they saw and experienced. And it changed their world. And I wonder if it could change yours. So happy Easter.